This is Reese Brady, dictating field report number 4 for the Pilgrim File. Now certain he was using the pen name Dick Nash throughout the 1980s. Pursuant to my last report, I'll be following up on Nash's activities on the eastern seaboard. Not entirely comfortable with this operation, the legal scope on this one is ambiguous, and I am not confident the client has disclosed all the relevant files. No trace evidence of the package was found when our team scanned his old Sunbeam. However, 2 boxes were found in the trunk, sealed with sellotape, probably for decades. One is marked fiction. All it contains is rough drafts for Nash's last 2 books. The Burlington site will perform further analysis. I'm already certain there is nothing there that will lead us to the package. The second box, marked non-fiction, is a different story. It's full of photos, maps, tapes, press clippings, handwritten notes. Contents are disconnected and out of order. Some appear to be personal narratives from Nash himself. The majority, however, seem to be accounts and anecdotes from other people. Nash must have been collecting these as research for his novels. I'm driving into Mound, West Virginia. It's been almost 40 years since Nash visited, but he spent at least a few days here and talked to at least a few locals. We'll see if any of them will talk to me.
When I showed up for my first day on the job at the glass-blowing factory in Mound, the foreman took one look at me and said I wouldn't last 3 days. Just to show him up, I waited until my 4th day to quit. The second the noon bell rang, I put on my coat and hat, and then I walked out. I only went back close to closing time to collect my pay. After that, I went into town to a place called Castleman's or Castile's or something like that. I bellied up to the bar and got busy spending my pay from the factory. I had the latest copy of Playboy. The only reason I bought that rag was they had just published Donald Westlake's latest piece. I folded the magazine carefully so nobody could tell what I was reading. Westlake is one of the greatest living writers, in my opinion. He's part of the reason I've decided to take up the pen myself. The gig at the factory was just to acquire enough cash for the gas and cigarettes I'd need to make it to the other side of West Virginia. My notebook was on the bar next to me. That must have been what first caught Bruce Mound's attention. He stumbled over to ask me if I was a reporter. By all indications, he'd been in this bar since breakfast. But by the way he dressed, he wasn't the typical towny bum you run into in a place like that. He looked like some rich guy's grown son, like he would fit in at Studio 54 in New York way more than at a dive like this in coal country. That's the only reason I tolerated the first few minutes of his presence. Any attempt I made to engage this drunken fellow in intelligent conversation was futile, however. Mound was only concerned with the nonsense tumbling out of his mouth in my direction. Most of it was nonsense, I was sure, at least at first. I now know better, but that came later. Mound rambled drunkenly on and on about his father, about how his father was the richest guy in town, about how his father was the most evil, nefarious bastard to have ever lived. Mound started dropping all kinds of names in this slurred diatribe, trying to impress me with how important his dad must have been at some point in the recent past. Maybe I should have written down in my notebook what he was saying to me, but at the time I just thought it was a bunch of baloney and didn't bother. I do remember he mentioned the name Allen Dulles, and a bunch of 3 or 4 letter acronyms for various government agencies that his father apparently had some kind of involvement in. I was trying to extract myself from this conversation and leave the bar when Mound came out and told me he wanted to engage me in a contract to be a ghostwriter for a series of articles or maybe even a book he wanted to get written. He said he had a hell of a story to tell regarding the various wrongdoings of his father, committed right here in Mound, West Virginia, at the family estate overlooking the town. He claimed that he knew all the right people who could get a tell-all memoir published. I did not believe Bruce Mound for a second about being able to get anything published, but my ears pricked up at the prospect of a writing contract. Bruce Mound certainly looked like he had money. Getting my hands on an advance for a writing project sounded a hell of a lot more appealing than the prospect of having to find another bullshit job in whatever town I ended up in next. So I decided to risk it and see what he had to offer. Bruce Mound had a car waiting for him. He told me to hop in and his driver would take us up to his family's manor house. I said I'd just follow him up there in my own car. A few minutes later, I was in my Sunbeam, following Mound's black sedan up a series of heavily wooded roads that twisted their way up the hillside from town. When I pulled up in the circle drive in front of the sprawling Tudor manor, a pair of Dobermans came bounding over to my car. I'd left the top down and for a moment was certain the beasts were about to pull me out of my seat. But Mound's driver appeared quickly enough and he shooed the hounds away. Mound stumbled out of the sedan and bid me enter the front door. The place was probably like you can imagine. Everything was parquetry, dark wood, cathedral ceilings, and gigantic fireplaces. Mound made an attempt to give me a tour of the place, but we ended up at a drink stand in the library where he proceeded to get even more drunk. I told him we should probably head over to his office so he can get the contract squared away. Then he could give me a tour after that while I take notes. This seemed to make him snap out of his stupor a bit. He got this look in his eyes, an expression of intense focus. "Don't be silly," he said to me. "First you gotta see what this book is going to be about. You gotta see what my dad was doing. He did experiments. He did them right here. He did them for the government." I became a little nervous at this and asked exactly what kind of experiments he was referring to. "Mind control experiments," is what Mound said to me. He all of a sudden seemed quite sober. Then he said, "All the stuff I told you about in the bar, you didn't write it down?" This threw me off, psychologically, I guess. Here I was, supposed to be a writer, and I had not written down a single thing so far. So I took my pen and notepad out of my coat pocket. Then I told Mound he'd probably better show me what he was talking about. "Right this way," Mound replied. What lay below that house was more than just a basement. It was a crypt. It was a series of subterranean rooms that were connected by doorways formed out of arcs of stonework. The place was creepy as hell. It was lit by old-fashioned gas lanterns mounted into the walls, which made my general impression of the place all that much less comfortable. Several of the rooms had obviously been converted into research labs. There were steel tables and glass cabinets filled with brown bottles with labels on them. But what really got me on edge was the presence of surgical equipment and gurneys that had heavy leather straps added to them. I asked Mound just what the hell went on down here, but he just ignored me and led me deeper into the place. The further we went, and the grislier the experimental apparatus I came upon, the more alarmed I grew. Excuse me, Bruce," I finally said. "May I call you Bruce?" We were in a room where there was an array of gas tanks lined up in the shadows along one wall. They looked like the steel canisters of helium that they used to inflate party balloons with. But I had no idea what was in those canisters. One of them had a long tube attached to its valve, and at the other end was a face mask. Mound had picked up this face mask, put it over his mouth and nose, and was huffing whatever was coming out of it. He'd look at me, take a huff, look at me again with a very dark expression in his eyes, then turn back and take another huff. He was no longer speaking to me. We were alone down there, and it dawned on me that Bruce Mound was larger than I was. Even though I was pretty sure I could remember how to get out of there, he just might be able to stop me, especially if he was hyped up on some kind of narcotic gas. Mound was not answering me, and I was getting the strong suspicion that sometime in the next few minutes I was going to be in for a very unpleasant surprise. The prospect of a writing contract became bleaker and bleaker with each huff Mound took out of that face mask. Mound had taken another puff and then turned to look at me again. I have no idea if he was just checking to see if I was still there, or if he was sizing me up, or if whatever vapors in that tank were making him believe he could talk to me telepathically. Whatever it was, I had made up my mind at that point to leave. Slowly, I started to back away from Bruce Mound. Mound mumbled something like, "Well, where are you going?" or something like that, but I didn't answer. I had a pretty good idea of how to get out of there to the basement steps, so I kept Mound in my line of sight and kept moving. Neither one of us said anything to each other. It was a case of classic nonverbal communication. I backed out of the room. Mound made no move to stop me. Time slowed way, way down. I was already on high alert after seeing all of the ghastly surgical equipment that the basement was hiding from the world. As I edged my way nearer and nearer to the basement steps, my eyes still locked on Mound's. There was a buzzing in the center of my head from my heart racing and all my senses being on overdrive. My heel hit the bottom stone step. I turned and hurried up the stairs. I got out into the corridor at the top and crossed the front hall. I kept expecting to hear the clatter of claws on parquetry and the ravenous pants of those two Dobermans as they were set upon me, but I made it back to my sunbeam unmolested. I was in a daze. I was not sure what I had just seen. I'm still not entirely sure. My hands and feet mechanically went through the motion of starting the car. The engine fired up after a couple of tries. I nearly jumped out of my skin when Mount's chauffeur suddenly appeared next to my driver door. He apologized for startling me and asked if everything was all right. I made sure to get the car in gear before saying anything back to him. I told the driver that he'd better go check on his boss, that his boss was in the basement last time I saw him. I remember when I said this, the color seemed to drain from the driver's face. I remember he asked, "Mr. Mound showed you the basement?" But by then I was rolling down the driveway, and soon I was heading back down the wooded hillside towards town. I drove around the town aimlessly for a while. I guess I was in a bit of a fugue from what had just happened. If I'd been stopped and asked for my name, I might not have been able to dredge that information up immediately. I remember reaching up to touch my head and realizing that my hat was gone. Then I pulled the car over, my memory replaying the whole ghastly story of the last 2 hours of my life. Briefly, I considered going to the police, but I quickly realized that would be pointless. It was the house of the richest guy in town, the guy who probably held considerable influence in a miserable little burg like this. Once I'd had the chance to think about it, I realized that Bruce Mound had never actually done anything to me. He never made any threats. He never endangered me in any way. I was a guest in his house. There was no way I could go to the police with what had just happened. Slowly, I dug through my pockets and counted the crumpled bills that remained after my afternoon at the bar. I summed up the number of cigarettes I still had left. There were, I calculated, enough to get me all the way south across the state. I pulled the Sunbeam back onto the road and kept driving.
I've confirmed there's no account under Nash or his real name at the local bank. It's funny that Nash, of all people, ran into the Mound family. Mr. Mound was certainly an asset to us, in his day. If the package ended up with the Mounds, it's gone now, along with the house and most of the family, in the fire that consumed the entire estate in '89. Burned down to the foundations. Bruce Mound is still alive and still institutionalized. Knox will have to be the one to talk to him. It looks like I'm headed south.